Officer Jake Daniels had seen plenty of rough nights on the job, but this one was supposed to be different, quiet, predictable, uneventful. That's how he liked it. The sun had dipped below the horizon, painting the small suburban town in fading hues of amber and indigo. Street lights flickered on one by one, casting long, empty shadows over the nearly deserted sidewalks. It was the kind of night where nothing much happened. Just a few minor traffic stops, the occasional noise complaint, and maybe a stray cat darting across the road. Daniels leaned against his patrol car, sipping on a lukewarm cup of coffee, enjoying the rare stillness. Then came the barking. Loud, persistent, agitated. Daniels narrowed his eyes as he scanned the dimly lit park across the street. A scruffy-looking dog, scrawny, ribs poking through a patchy, unkempt coat, paced near a bench, barking at passing pedestrians. A woman pulled her coat tighter and crossed the street to avoid it. A man muttered something under his breath as he picked up his pace. Daniels sighed, setting his coffee on the hood of his cruiser. He had no patience for strays. They were unpredictable, sometimes aggressive, and always a nuisance. In his years on the force, he'd dealt with enough to know they had a way of causing trouble. He unclipped the pepper spray from his belt as he stepped forward. A quick spritz would be enough to send the mutt scurrying off. Nothing harmful, just enough to stop the barking and keep it from bothering anyone else. "Shoo! Get out of here!" he barked, his boots crunching against the gravel path as he advanced. The dog hesitated, ears flattening against its head, but didn't run. Daniels raised the canister and pressed down. A fine mist shot out, hitting the dog square in the face. It yelped, stumbling back, pawing at its eyes. For a split second, Daniels felt a flicker of satisfaction, problem solved. But then something unexpected happened. Instead of running away, the dog bolted, not in fear, but with purpose. It whipped around and sprinted across the park, straight toward the shadowy figure of a man sitting in a wheelchair beneath a towering oak tree. Daniels frowned. His instincts kicked in. Something wasn't right. The dog reached the man, pressing its head into his lap, its body trembling. Even from a distance, Daniels could see the man react immediately. His hands moved with practiced urgency, pulling out a cloth and gently wiping the dog's face, murmuring something too soft to hear. The dog, despite the lingering sting of the pepper spray, wagged its tail. Daniels felt his stomach drop. This wasn't a stray. He took a cautious step closer, guilt creeping in like an unwelcome shadow. The man looked up. Even in the dim light, Daniels could see the raw emotion in his expression. Pain, sadness, something deeper, something that made Daniels feel like he had just made a terrible mistake. Daniels cleared his throat, suddenly unsure of himself. That your dog?" The man's voice was low, steady, but carried an edge of something Daniels couldn't quite place. "Yeah, this is Scout." His fingers never stopped moving, soothing the dog, his grip steady despite the tremor in his voice. "He's not a stray. He's my service dog." Daniels felt the words hit him like a punch to the gut. He had just sprayed a service dog. A dog that wasn't just barking aimlessly, but trying to get help. The weight of the situation pressed down on him, heavier than his bulletproof vest. For the first time in years, Officer Daniels regretted an action he had taken in uniform. And deep down he knew this wasn't over. Not even close. Because whatever was happening here, it was much bigger than a stray dog barking in the night. The weight of the moment hung thick in the air. Officer Jake Daniels had faced down criminals, broken up fights, and even dealt with violent offenders, but nothing had prepared him for the gut-wrenching realization settling in his chest. He had just assaulted a service dog, and now the man in the wheelchair, Scout's owner, was staring up at him, his expression unreadable. Daniels swallowed hard, shifting uncomfortably on his feet. "Look, He hesitated, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "I didn't know he was a service dog." The man's fingers ran over Scout's fur, offering quiet reassurance to the trembling dog. "Most people don't look close enough to see," he said, his voice low but steady. "They just assume." Daniels felt a sting of guilt. That's exactly what he had done. He'd seen a barking dog, assumed it was a stray, and acted on impulse. "I'm sorry," Daniels admitted, surprising even himself. He wasn't the type to hand out apologies easily, but this situation was different. The man exhaled slowly, as if measuring his response. He was younger than Daniels had first thought, maybe late 30s, but there was something in his posture, in his weathered face, that spoke of years of hardship. His clothes were clean but worn, his wheelchair showing signs of age and heavy use. Daniel's eyes flicked to the man's legs, hidden beneath a pair of faded jeans. The way he sat, his stillness, told Daniels what he needed to know. The man wasn't in that wheelchair temporarily. He wasn't getting out of it. The silence stretched between them until the man finally spoke. "My name's Robert." He nodded toward Scout, who had stopped trembling but still pressed close. "And this guy, he's more than just a dog. He's my lifeline." Daniels wasn't sure how to respond to that. He wasn't great at emotional conversations. His job demanded that he keep a certain level of detachment, but something about the way Robert spoke, the quiet weight of his words, made Daniels pause. Robert sighed, looking away for a moment before meeting Daniels' gaze again. "Scout's trained to help me. He senses when I need assistance, picks up on things before I even realize them myself." He gave the dog a gentle scratch behind the ears. "He's the only reason I can still live on my own." Daniels glanced at Scout, now lying at Robert's feet, his tail twitching slightly. The dog was still recovering from the spray, but he hadn't tried to run. Instead, he had sought comfort, not for himself, but for Robert. Daniels felt another pang of regret. "I can get him some water," he offered, glancing toward a nearby fountain. Robert gave a slow nod. That'd help. Daniels turned and walked toward the fountain, grabbing the collapsible bowl hanging from the side of Robert's wheelchair. He filled it carefully, the water glinting under the streetlights. As he walked back, he couldn't help but glance at Robert again, noticing the faint scars along his forearms, the way his fingers flexed slightly before settling on his lap. This guy had been through something big. Daniels crouched down, setting the water bowl beside Scout. The dog sniffed it hesitantly before lapping it up, his tail wagging just slightly. "He's tough," Daniels said. Robert gave a small smile. "Had to be." Daniels hesitated before asking, "What happened to you?" Robert's fingers stilled against Scout's fur. His eyes darkened, his expression shifting, not with anger, but something deeper. He let out a slow breath. "5 years ago, I was a firefighter." His voice was even, but there was something raw beneath the surface. "I ran into burning buildings for a living. Saved people. That's all I ever wanted to do." He exhaled, shaking his head. "Then one night, a call came in, apartment fire, people trapped inside. We went in, but the building," his jaw tightened. "It didn't hold." Daniels didn't move, didn't interrupt. Robert continued. "We were on the 3rd floor when it collapsed. I barely made it out alive. 2 of my team didn't." His voice dropped lower. "And neither did my legs." Daniels felt the weight of those words. Robert tapped his fingers against the wheelchair frame. "For a long time, I thought my life was over. I had nothing. No job. No purpose. No reason to keep going." His gaze dropped to Scout, who had finished drinking and was now watching him intently. "Then, 2 years after the accident, I met him." Daniels nodded toward Scout. "At a shelter." Robert shook his head. "Service Dog Training Center." He wasn't supposed to make it through the program. Too skittish, too reactive. He'd been abandoned as a puppy, left to fend for himself. But something about him. He trailed off, his eyes softening. "We were both broken, and together we started to heal." Daniels didn't speak right away. He wasn't sure what to say. He wasn't used to hearing stories like this. At least, not from the other side. He dealt with the aftermath of violence, of cruelty, but rarely the slow, painful road that followed. "Scout's not just a dog," Robert said, his voice quieter now. "He's trained to help me with the physical stuff, fetching things, opening doors. But that's not the most important part. He knows when I'm not okay. When I wake up in the middle of the night, sweating, heart racing, feeling like I'm back in that fire, he's there. He pulls me back, keeps me here." Daniels watched as Scout rested his head against Robert's leg, His amber eyes locked onto his owner's face. He wasn't just a pet. He wasn't even just a service animal. He was a survivor, just like Robert. Daniels exhaled, the last remnants of his earlier frustration disappearing. He had come over here annoyed, ready to chase off a stray. Instead, he'd walked right into a story he never saw coming. And somehow, he had the feeling this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Daniels wasn't sure why he stayed. He could have walked away, let the moment pass, chalked it up as a mistake and moved on. But something about Robert, his story, the quiet weight of it, held him there. Scout had settled down at Robert's feet, still alert but no longer trembling. The scent of pepper spray still lingered faintly in the air, a reminder of how badly Daniels had misread the situation. He sighed, shifting his weight. "Look, I screwed up." Robert gave a slow nod. "Yeah, you did." His voice wasn't angry, just factual. Daniels glanced at Scout. "Does he need to see a vet?" "I can. He'll be okay," Robert interrupted, running a hand over the dog's fur. "It's not the first time someone's mistaken him for a stray." That sentence sat heavy between them. Daniels hesitated before asking, "How often does that happen?" Robert exhaled, his fingers tapping lightly against the frame of his wheelchair. "More than you'd think. People see a rough-looking dog, and they assume the worst." He glanced down at Scout. "They don't see what I see." Daniels had no response to that. He knew what it was like to make snap judgments. It was part of the job. But this time, it had felt different, more personal. A gust of wind swept through the park, rustling the leaves overhead. The streetlights buzzed faintly, casting long shadows across the pavement. Daniels shifted uncomfortably. He wasn't used to standing still, especially when his gut told him there was more to the story. Why was he barking so much earlier? Daniels finally asked. Robert's expression darkened, because he knew something was wrong. Daniels frowned. "Wrong how?" Robert hesitated. Then, instead of answering, he reached into the side pouch of his wheelchair and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. He unfolded it and handed it to Daniels. Daniels took it, smoothing out the creases. The message was scrawled in jagged, uneven handwriting. "Leave while you still can. Next time IT won't just be a warning." Daniels' jaw tightened. "Where did you find this?" Robert nodded toward the ground near the tree, where he'd been sitting. "Tucked under my wheel when I got here." A slow, cold anger settled in Daniels' chest. He wasn't new to threats. He had dealt with enough in his career to know when someone wasn't bluffing. And something about this note didn't feel like an empty warning. Robert watched him carefully. "Now you see why Scout was on edge." Daniels glanced down at the dog. Scout was staring at him, his body tense, his ears flicked forward. He wasn't just protecting Robert. He was anticipating something. Daniels folded the note and slipped it into his pocket. "Have you gotten threats like this before?" Robert hesitated just long enough to make Daniels suspicious. "A few." Daniels narrowed his eyes. "And you didn't report them?" Robert let out a dry, humorless chuckle. "Report them to who, officer?" "The same people who think my dog is a stray. The same people who assume a guy like me is just another problem to deal with." Daniels stiffened, knowing there was truth in those words. Still, threats weren't something he could ignore. "Do you have any idea who might be behind this?" Robert exhaled slowly. "I have a few theories." Daniels crossed his arms. "Start talking." Robert hesitated, his fingers tightening slightly against his wheelchair frame. Then, after a long pause, he said, "It has to do with where Scout came from." Daniels frowned. "You mean the Service Dog Center?" Robert shook his head. "No. Before that." He glanced down at Scout, running a hand over his back. "I don't know everything about his past, but I know enough to be sure that someone out there doesn't want me asking questions." Daniels felt his cop instincts kick in. "What kind of questions?" Robert finally looked up, his expression unreadable. The kind that could get people hurt. A sharp bark from Scout made both men turn. The dog was up on his feet, ears pinned back, body stiff. His eyes locked onto something just beyond the street lamp's glow. Daniels followed his gaze. A dark SUV sat parked across the street, its engine running. The windows were tinted. No one got out. Daniel's hand went to his belt instinctively, fingers brushing his holster. His pulse quickened. Robert's voice was quiet but firm. "This has been happening for weeks." Daniels turned to him. "You didn't think to mention that." Robert's jaw tightened. Would it have made a difference? Daniels didn't answer. Instead, he stepped forward, putting himself slightly in front of Robert's wheelchair as he stared at the SUV. He couldn't see inside, but he could feel it, the weight of someone watching. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the SUV pulled away, its tires rolling smoothly over the pavement before disappearing around the corner. Daniels let out a slow breath, the tension in his shoulders refusing to fade. This wasn't just some random threat. This was something bigger. And for the first time that night, he realized he wasn't just dealing with a mistake anymore. He was dealing with a warning. And the question was, who was it for? Him or Robert? Daniels watched the SUV disappear into the night, the engine's low hum fading as it turned the corner. But the uneasy feeling in his gut stayed. Whoever had been inside that vehicle hadn't just stumbled onto the scene. They were watching. Daniels turned back to Robert, who sat motionless in his wheelchair, his expression unreadable. Scout remained tense beside him, eyes locked on the spot where the SUV had been. "How long has this been going on?" Daniels asked, his voice lower now, more serious. Robert sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "A few weeks. Different cars, different people. Sometimes they just sit and watch. Other times, I find notes like that one." Daniels pulled the crumpled thread from his pocket and reread it. "Next time it won't just be a warning." The weight of those words settled over him like a thick fog. "You should have reported this," Daniels muttered. Robert scoffed. "Yeah, and then what? They file a report. Maybe send a cruiser by once or twice. These people aren't stupid. They'd lay low until it blew over, then pick up right where they left off." Daniels didn't argue. He'd seen that kind of thing happen before. Reports got filed, but real action? That was rare. Still, this wasn't something he could just walk away from. "You said this has to do with Scout," Daniels said. "What aren't you telling me?" Robert hesitated, his fingers tightening around the armrest of his wheelchair. "I told you he was a rescue, but I never told you from what." Daniels got twisted. "What do you mean?" Robert exhaled slowly. "Scout came from a fighting ring." Daniels blinked. He'd handled plenty of animal cruelty cases, but dog fighting was a whole different level of sick. Robert continued, his voice quieter now. "He wasn't a fighter, though. He was a bait dog." Daniels clenched his jaw. A bait dog, used to train aggressive fighters, treated like disposable practice dummies. The thought made his blood boil. "I got him from a rescue group that shut down one of those operations." "The thing is," Robert hesitated, his eyes darkening, "not everyone in that group made it out." Daniels stiffened. "Meaning?" Robert met his gaze. "Some of those dogs were taken, sold to people who had a lot of money and no conscience." His fingers ran absently through Scout's fur. "The people running that operation? They never got caught. Just shut down that location and disappeared." Daniels understood now. This wasn't just about some local crank upset about a barking dog. This was about unfinished business. "Someone's looking for him," Daniels muttered. "And they're looking for you." Robert nodded. "And I don't think they plan on leaving empty-handed." A long silence stretched between them. The street lights buzzed overhead, casting faint halos on the pavement. Daniels had dealt with some real lowlifes before. Drug dealers, gang members, violent offenders. But there was something uniquely disgusting about people who profited off the suffering of animals. And if they were willing to go this far, it meant they were dangerous. Robert shifted in his wheelchair. "They don't just want Scout back, Daniels. They want to erase every trace of what happened. And if I get in the way of that..." He trailed off, his meaning clear. Daniels felt his jaw tighten. He had started this night, just wanting to move along a so-called nuisance. Now he was staring down a fight that had nothing to do with the badge on his chest, and everything to do with the kind of man he wanted to be. A fight that felt personal. Scout let out a soft growl, his body still tense. Daniels turned his head, just in time, to see something that made his pulse spike. A figure was standing at the end of the block, still, watching. Then, just as quickly as Daniels spotted him, The man turned and walked away into the shadows. Daniel's hand hovered near his radio. Instinct told him to call for backup, but his gut said otherwise. This wasn't something that could be handled by some patrol cars rolling through town. This was something that had been playing out long before he showed up tonight. He turned back to Robert. "You have a place to stay that isn't here." Robert frowned. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying," Daniel said, glancing back down the street, "that you and Scout need to lay low until I figure out what the hell is going on." Robert snorted. "And what? You're going to handle this all on your own?" Daniels crossed his arms. "Do you have a better plan?" Robert sighed. "I have a friend. She runs a rescue a couple of towns over. I could crash there for a few days." Daniels nodded. "Good. Do it." "And Robert?" Robert looked up. Daniel's expression hardened. "If these guys come back, you call me." No hesitation. Robert studied him for a long moment, then nodded. Daniels didn't know exactly what he was getting himself into. But one thing was clear. This wasn't just about a mistake he had made. This was about a war that had been waiting to explode. And now, he was in it. Daniels kept his eyes locked on the darkened street long after the shadowy figure had disappeared. Every instinct screamed at him this wasn't over. If anything, it was just getting started. Robert shifted in his wheelchair, gripping the armrest. "You think they're coming back?" Daniels clenched his jaw. "I don't think they ever left." Scout let out a low, uneasy whine, his nose twitching as he stared into the distance. He felt it too. The tension in the air, the invisible weight pressing down on all of them. Daniels ran a hand over his face. This situation was spiraling fast. He had no official case, no backup, no jurisdiction to go after a crime that had long since gone cold. But none of that mattered anymore. These people weren't just trying to reclaim a dog. They were tying up loose ends. And Robert, he was one of them. Daniels took a slow breath and crouched down, so he was at eye level with Robert. "You need to listen to me carefully," he said, his tone firmer now. "You and Scout leave tonight. That friend of yours, call her. Make sure she knows you're coming." Robert hesitated. "And what about you?" Daniels glanced down at the note still clutched in his fist. "Leave while you still can." A direct message. But was it meant for Robert? Or had Daniels just made himself part of the target? "I'm going to find out who's behind this," Daniels said finally. "If these people are still running a ring, I'll make sure they don't stay in business much longer." Robert let out a dry laugh. "You do realize you're taking this on alone?" Daniel smirked, though there was no real humor in it. Wouldn't be the first time. Robert stared at him for a long moment, then exhaled. He reached down, running his fingers through Scout's fur. The dog nudged his hand, sensing the tension, his amber eyes steady and calm. "All right," Robert said. "We'll leave tonight." Daniels nodded. "Good." A beat of silence passed. The distant hum of a passing car filled the air, then faded into nothing. The streets were quiet again, but the sense of unease hadn't lifted. Daniels stood up, scanning the area one last time before turning back to Robert. "One more thing." Robert raised an eyebrow. "Yeah." Daniel's voice was like steel. "If they come after you again, you don't wait. You don't try to fight them off. You call me." Robert gave a slow nod. "Understood." Daniels stepped back, his fingers brushing against his holstered weapon. He wasn't sure what the next few hours would bring, but one thing was certain. He wasn't letting this go. Whoever was behind this had made a mistake. They had threatened the wrong man. And now, Daniels was about to make sure they regretted it. Daniels sat in his patrol car long after Robert and Scout had left, his fingers drumming restlessly against the steering wheel. The street was quiet again, but he wasn't fooled. They were still out there, watching, waiting. His radio crackled, dispatch calling in an unrelated report, but he ignored it. His focus was elsewhere, on the note in his pocket, on the dark SUV that had disappeared around the corner, on the feeling in his gut that told him things were about to get worse. He had a decision to make. He could do what any other cop might. Write up a brief report, let it get buried in paperwork, pretend it wasn't his problem. Or he could follow the lead, dig deeper, risk everything. Daniels sighed, then pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts. He stopped at one name, Detective Marcus Reed. A good cop. One of the few he trusted. He hit dial. Reed. The voice was groggy. Daniels had forgotten it was nearly midnight. Yeah, it's me, Daniels said. I need a favor. Reed sighed. Why do I feel like this is going to get me into trouble? Daniels smirked. Because it probably will. A pause. Then, what do you need? Daniels hesitated, then said, I need you to run a plate. Black SUV. No lights, no plates. But it's been circling the area. Reed was quiet for a moment. Then, you think it's connected to something? Daniels exhaled. I know it is. Give me 10 minutes. The line went dead. Daniels tossed his phone onto the passenger seat and ran a hand through his hair. He knew he was poking a bear, but there was no turning back now. 10 minutes stretched into 15, then 20. Then his phone rang. He answered before the first ring finished. What do you got? Reed's voice was different this time. Tense. Alert. Daniels, whatever you're mixed up in, you need to be careful. Daniels' stomach tightened. Talk to me. The SUV is registered to a shell company. Fake business. No real ownership records. Reed hesitated. But I traced the business back to a name. Daniels gripped the steering wheel. Who? Reed took a slow breath. Gerald Knox. The name sent a cold chill down Daniels' spine. Knox was a ghost, a known name in underground crime circles, but never caught, never seen, never proven guilty. He was rumored to run illegal animal trafficking operations, among other things. The kind of guy that didn't just operate in the shadows. He was the shadows? Daniel's mind raced. If Knox's people were sniffing around Robert and Scout, that meant one thing. They wanted something covered up, and they weren't going to stop until they got it. Daniels hung up and started his car, determination hardening in his chest. Robert and Scout weren't safe. Not even close. A break-in at the shelter by the time Daniels reached the small rescue shelter where Robert had gone. It was well past 2 a.m. The place sat on the outskirts of town, quiet, isolated, surrounded by empty fields. Too quiet. Daniels parked down the road and killed his headlights. He stepped out, hand resting on his holster as he moved toward the building. The front door was ajar. A sinking feeling settled in his gut. He pushed the door open slowly, his other hand moving to his flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing overturned chairs, scattered papers, and blood. Small droplets on the floor. Not a lot, but enough to make his pulse quicken. Then, a faint sound. A whimper. Daniels followed it, moving carefully down the hallway. A door at the end of the hall was slightly open, and when he stepped inside, his stomach clenched. The woman who ran the shelter, Robert's friend, was on the floor, dazed but alive, clutching her shoulder. They took him, she rasped. They took Robert. Daniel's blood ran cold. Where? She winced as she tried to sit up. I don't know, 2 men, big guys. They forced him into a van. Scout fought them off as best he could, but Daniels swallowed hard. Where's Scout? She gestured toward the back of the room. Daniels followed the direction and found the dog in the corner, panting, his fur streaked with blood that wasn't his own. Scout's eyes locked onto Daniels, and in them, he saw pure fury. They tried to kill him, the woman whispered, but he didn't go down easy. Daniels knelt beside Scout, placing a steady hand on the dog's back. The dog was shaking, not from fear, but from rage. Daniel's jaw tightened. This wasn't just about intimidation anymore. They had taken Robert, and Daniels knew one thing for certain. If they had taken him to Knox, Robert didn't have much time left. He stood up, pulling out his phone. Reed, he said the second the call connected. I need everything you have on Gerald Knox. Now. Reed didn't even hesitate. What's going on? Daniel's grip tightened around his phone. They just kidnapped someone. Reed swore under his breath. Tell me you're not planning to go after them alone. Daniels glanced at Scout, who was still staring at the door, his entire body tense. No, Daniels said. I'm not alone. Then he hung up, his heart pounding as he looked down at the battered, blood-stained dog beside him. Come on, boy, he murmured. We're getting him back. Scout let out a low growl. Daniels knew he understood. They had a fight ahead of them. And this time, they weren't backing down. Daniels gripped the steering wheel as his patrol car sped through the empty streets. The street lights flickered past in a blur, but his mind was sharper than ever. Robert had been taken. Knox was behind it. And Scout, bloodied but unbroken, was ready to fight. The dog sat beside him in the passenger seat, eyes locked on the road ahead, his body tense with restless energy. Daniels didn't need backup. He needed justice. A call from Reed came through his speaker. I ran down a few leads. Knox has an old warehouse out near the industrial district. It's not listed under his name, but let's be real. That's where he'll be. Daniels didn't hesitate. Send me the address. Reed hesitated. You sure you don't want me to call this in? Daniels tightened his grip. If we call it in, Knox disappears before backup even gets there. We don't have time for that. A pause. Then, be careful, man. Daniels ended the call and glanced at Scout. We're getting him back, boy. Scout let out a low growl in response, ears pinned back. The second Daniels reached the warehouse district, he killed the engine and cut the headlights. The place was old, abandoned, at least on paper. A single black SUV was parked outside, the same one that had been circling Robert for weeks. Daniels pulled his gun from its holster and checked the magazine. Then he turned to Scout. Stay close. The dog didn't need to be told twice. Moving quickly, Daniels slipped through the shadows toward the entrance. A single dim light flickered above the warehouse door. He pressed himself against the wall, listening. Inside, muffled voices. Then a grunt. Robert. Daniels' pulse spiked. He tried the door. Locked. Then, a low growl rumbled beside him. Daniels looked down at Scout, who had shifted into a predator stance. The dog's gaze was locked on a rusted side door, his ears twitching. Daniels nodded. All right, boy. Show me what you got. Scout darted toward the side entrance and, without hesitation, lunged at the handle, snapping his powerful jaws around the metal, shaking it violently. The rusted hinges groaned. Then the door popped open. Daniels grinned. Good boy. Gun raised, he slipped inside. The warehouse was dimly lit, crates stacked high against the walls. In the center, Robert sat bound to a chair, a fresh bruise on his cheek. Two men stood beside him, but Daniels' eyes locked onto the third figure stepping out of the shadows. Gerald Knox. Daniels raised his gun. Let him go. Knox chuckled. Ah, Officer Daniels. I was wondering when you'd show up. Daniels didn't blink. Last chance, Knox. Knox smirked. Or what? Then Scout growled, a sound so low and menacing that even Knox's men took a step back. And in that moment, Daniels knew this fight was about to end. For a long moment, no one moved. Daniels stood with his gun steady, eyes locked onto Gerald Knox. The man was everything the rumors said, cold, calculating, a predator disguised in expensive clothes. He didn't flinch under pressure, didn't show fear. But Scout's growl, that made even his men hesitate. Robert sat bound in the chair, breathing heavily, but his eyes were sharp. He was waiting for an opening, waiting for Daniels to make his move. Knox smirked. You've got guts, officer. I'll give you that. He gestured lazily toward Scout. And the mutt's impressive, I'll admit. But you think you're walking out of here? Daniels didn't respond. He was already calculating. Two men, armed, standing too close to Robert. Knox, confident but not stupid. He had maybe 3 seconds if this turned into a fight. Scout let out a warning growl. His muscles coiled. He was waiting for a command. Knox sighed, shaking his head. You're making this harder than it needs to be, Daniels. This isn't about you. It was never about you. Just hand over the dog, and you and your friend here can walk away. Daniels felt his blood turn to ice. This wasn't just about silencing Robert. They wanted Scout. Daniels tightened his grip on the gun. Why? What's so special about this dog? Knox chuckled. You really don't get it, do you? That mutt wasn't supposed to survive. He nodded toward Scout. We used him to train the fighters, toughen them up. But he wasn't strong enough, wasn't aggressive enough. Should have been put down. But he slipped through the cracks. Daniels felt his stomach churn. Knox's voice hardened. And now, he's evidence. Daniels understood. Scout wasn't just a survivor. He was proof. Proof that Knox's operation existed. Proof of the horrors they inflicted on those dogs. Proof that could bring the whole thing crashing down. Which meant Knox had only one goal: erase every trace of that evidence. Daniels took a slow breath. He had been in standoffs before. The trick was controlling the moment, making the other side think they still had options. But Scout wasn't playing by the rules. In a blur, the dog launched forward. He went for the closest man, his powerful jaws snapping onto the guy's forearm before the man could even react. A scream tore through the warehouse as the guy stumbled backward, knocking over a crate. Daniels moved. He fired one shot, hitting the second man in the shoulder before he could draw his weapon. The guy crashed to the ground, groaning in pain. Robert kicked back with his chair, throwing Knox off balance. Daniels didn't hesitate. He closed the distance, grabbing Knox by the collar and slamming him into the nearest stack of crates. The man let out a sharp grunt, but Daniels pinned him hard, gun pressed against his ribs. "It's over," Daniels growled. Knox smirked, his lip bleeding. "You think so?" A low click. Daniels felt it before he saw it. Knox had a knife in his hand, the blade pressing against Daniels' vest. Scout let out a savage snarl. Before Knox could make his move, the dog lunged, knocking him backward, sending the knife skittering across the floor. Daniels didn't wait. He flipped Knox onto his stomach, yanked his arms behind his back, and snapped the cuffs into place. Knox let out a slow, bitter laugh. "You have no idea what you've done." Daniels leaned in close. "Yeah, neither do you." The aftermath by the time backup arrived. The warehouse was a crime scene. Knox's men were in cuffs, the evidence of their illegal operation laid bare. Cages, bloodstained mats, the ghosts of fights that had stolen the lives of too many dogs. Robert, bruised but alive, sat with Scout beside him. The dog hadn't left his side since Daniels cut him loose. Reed approached, shaking his head as he took in the scene. "Hell of a mess you made." Daniels exhaled. "Had to be done." Reed smirked. "You'll be writing reports on this for weeks." Daniels glanced at Scout, who was sitting at Robert's feet, his tail wagging slightly despite the chaos. "Worth it." Robert let out a tired laugh. "You know, for a guy who pepper-sprayed my dog, you turned out all right." Daniels rolled his eyes. Yeah. Don't get sentimental on me now." Robert patted Scout's head, his expression turning serious. "What happens to the rest of them?" Daniels looked toward the cages. "They'll be taken to shelters. Some might even find homes." Robert's jaw tightened. "That's not good enough." Daniels met his gaze. "I know." Robert exhaled. "I'll take them." Daniels raised an eyebrow. "All of them?" Robert nodded. "I already started something, Daniels. Might as well finish it." Daniels studied him for a long moment, then smirked. "Reed, you hear that? We just found ourselves a new rescue operation." Reed chuckled. "Yeah, I bet the paperwork on that's going to be a nightmare." Daniels turned to Robert. "You sure about this?" Robert scratched behind Scout's ears. "Scout saved me when I had nothing. Maybe it's time we do the same for them." Daniels nodded, and for the first time that night, he felt something settle in his chest. Something that felt a lot like justice. The sun was just beginning to rise as Daniels stepped out of the station, the crisp morning air a welcome relief after a long night of paperwork and questioning. Knox was in custody, but Daniels knew a man like that had connections. This wasn't the end of the fight, just the beginning of a legal one. But for now, it was over. Scout waited outside with Robert, his tail thumping lazily against the pavement. The bruises on Robert's face were starting to show, but he looked alive in a way Daniels hadn't seen before. Robert smirked as Daniels approached. "Guess we both had a long night." Daniels exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. "You could say that." He nodded toward Scout. "How's he holding up?" Robert knelt down, scratching behind the dog's ears. "Tough as ever." Scout nudged his hand in response, then turned to Daniels, watching him carefully, as if he understood everything that had happened. Daniels crouched down, meeting Scout's gaze. "You saved his life last night. You know that." Scout wagged his tail. Robert chuckled. He's not the only one. Daniels stood and crossed his arms. So, you're really doing this? Taking in the dogs? Robert nodded. It's not just about saving them. It's about giving them a future. The ones that can be adopted, I'll find homes for. The ones that need more time, they'll have a place with me. Daniels shook his head with a smirk. You're out of your damn mind. Robert grinned. Probably. A silence stretched between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that came from understanding, from knowing that neither of them would ever see the world the same way again. Daniels took a deep breath. You need anything, you call me. Robert raised an eyebrow. Even if it's not police business. Daniels glanced at Scout, then back at Robert. Especially then. Robert smiled. Careful, Daniels. That almost sounded friendly. Daniels rolled his eyes and turned to leave. But just as he reached his car, he paused. Without turning around, he said, Take care of that dog, Robert. Robert's voice was steady. I think he's been taking care of me. Daniel smirked, then got into his car and drove off. As the city slowly woke around him, he knew one thing for certain. He had started the night as just another cop on patrol. But now, he was part of something bigger. And maybe, just maybe, he was a better man for it.